Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug that doesn't knock you out. It doesn't make you see things. It doesn't announce itself at all. It just takes you away, leaving your body running on its own, breathing, walking, talking, handing strangers your bank card with a helpful smile. And when it's over, you won't remember any of it. You'll be there. You just won't be home. They call it scopolamine, a clean, clinical name for something that rarely stays that way. On the street, it goes by other names. Burundanga, devil's breath. It has been a surgical tool, a spy weapon, a seasickness patch, and the most common instrument of robbery in South America. Tonight we're tracing how the drug that promised to remove pain became the drug that removed consent, and why a century of very powerful people couldn't stop reaching for it. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now. Perhaps tucked under a blanket, halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. To understand what scopolamine actually does, you need to stop thinking about it as a drug. You don't feel it arriving. There's no shiver, no sudden warmth, no signal from your body that anything has changed. You're standing in a bar or walking through a market or sitting across from a stranger at a restaurant in Bogota, and you are fine. You are entirely fine. And then gradually, you're not. Except you won't know that. The part of you that would notice is already offline. Your surroundings don't change. The bar is still the bar. The street, the lights, the music, all exactly as they were. Nothing looks wrong. You feel, if anything, relaxed. A little distant maybe. Like you've had one drink more than you remember having, like you're watching yourself from somewhere, slightly behind your own eyes. The stranger says something, you answer. Your voice sounds normal to you. The words make sense to you. You are, from the outside, completely coherent. Helpful, even. You're standing up straight and making eye contact and responding to questions with full sentences. Nobody around you knows. You don't know. Here's what's actually happening while you're standing there looking completely fine. It blocks a signal in your brain, a quiet little signal that runs constantly underneath everything you think and do that says, "This is me. I am here. I am the one deciding." When that signal goes quiet, something strange happens. You don't fall asleep. You don't lose consciousness. You don't stop functioning. You keep going perfectly, like a piece of machinery that's been switched to manual. You can walk. You can talk. You can follow instructions. You can answer questions about your PIN number, your home address, where you keep your cash, and whether you'd like to walk with this person to the ATM. You would like to. You say so. You're happy to help. The instructions just come from somewhere else now. The stranger asks you to come with them. You go. They walk you to a cash machine 3 blocks away. You watch your own hands put in your code. You watch the money come out. You give it to them. They ask if there's more. You tell them, helpfully, that there's a second account. You tell them the number. You're not scared. That's the part that's hardest to explain later, when you're trying to describe it to the police. You weren't scared. You weren't confused. You weren't struggling or trying to run. You just helped them. Like a very cooperative version of yourself had taken over, and the real you had stepped outside for a moment. The real you was still in there, somewhere, watching. Not alarmed, not protesting, just watching. Like a passenger in a car who doesn't know the driver, but isn't worried about it. Later, an hour later, 2 hours, sometimes longer, something shifts. The signal comes back. You're sitting on a bench or in a cafe or on a curb somewhere you don't recognize. The stranger is gone. Your wallet is lighter. Your phone might be gone. You feel physically completely fine. No hangover, no headache, no blur. You feel fine in the way you feel fine when you've slept too long, slightly outside the day, slightly disconnected from the sequence of hours. You check the time, it's later than it should be. You try to remember what happened after you arrived. You try to find the last clear thing. You had a coffee, maybe. You met someone. You think you met someone. It's not like forgetting a dream, where you can feel the shape of it even if the details are gone. It's more like reaching for something that was never there. Not a gap, an absence, a clean wall where a memory should be. Nothing hurts. You're not shaking, not crying, not obviously distressed in any way a stranger could identify. You just have no idea where the last 2 hours went. In Bogota, they called it Burundanga. Street name, working name, the name people used when they called the police to say it happened again. In the Andes, it grew in gardens, unremarkable, behind houses, used for centuries in rituals that understood it for what it was. Dangerous, powerful, not casual. In Germany, in 1902, an Austrian surgeon named Richard von Steinbüchel mixed it with morphine and handed it to a woman in labour and called it Dämmerschlaf, twilight sleep. She gave birth without pain. She remembered nothing of it. He considered this a success. The woman, when asked later what the birth had been like, said she didn't know. She had no memory of it at all. He considered this also a success, and that small gap between the doctor's definition of success and the patient's experience of absence is where this entire story begins. The plant has been around longer than the story. That's the thing about scopolamine. It didn't come from a lab. It didn't come from a government program or a pharmaceutical company or a chemist who mixed the wrong things on Friday afternoon. It came from a flower, a bell-shaped flower that hangs down from its stem, very pretty, very unremarkable, growing in hedgerows and gardens all over the world. The nightshade family. You know some of them, tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, the friendly ones. But the family also includes henbane, mandrake, deadly nightshade, and a South American plant the locals call the borrachero, which translates, roughly, as the one that makes you drunk. The borrachero produces scopolamine in its seeds, its leaves, its flowers, abundantly. Without any apparent effort, it has no idea anyone cares. People noticed the plant's properties long before they could explain them. The nightshade family has been causing problems for as long as humans have been paying attention to plants. Ancient physicians knew that some of these plants in small amounts could ease pain and slow a racing heart. They also knew that in larger amounts the same plants could produce delirium, hallucinations and death, sometimes in that order. Medieval herbalists referenced them. Renaissance women used diluted preparations of belladonna to dilate their pupils, which was fashionable, and occasionally did other things to them, which was less so. Henbane, one of the plants that carries scopolamine, shows up in Shakespeare. In Hamlet, the ghost of Hamlet's father describes being murdered by poison poured in his ear. The poison is henbane. This is botanically improbable as a delivery mechanism, but atmospherically very correct. The borrachero, the South American relative, which would eventually give the story its most dramatic chapter, was used in ritual ceremonies across Colombia and Venezuela for centuries. Healers who worked with it understood it as dangerous, powerful, a substance that required preparation, knowledge, intention, not something you handed out casually. The casual version of the story arrived later and from a different direction. In 1676, a group of British soldiers was sent to Virginia to suppress a rebellion. The locals, for reasons that history has not fully explained, prepared them a meal that included Datura stramonium, Jimson weed, a member of the same plant family containing the same molecules. The soldiers ate it. What followed was documented by a historian named Robert Beverley, who described it with the careful understatement of a man trying very hard not to laugh. The soldiers turned into what he called natural fools. They grinned at each other without apparent reason. They pawed at the air. They blew feathers about. They made faces at their commanding officers. They were, in his assessment, completely incapable of carrying out their mission. This lasted 11 days. 11 days. An entire military unit, confused and helpless, wandering around Virginia like they had genuinely forgotten what they were doing there, which they had. They came back to themselves eventually. They remembered nothing. They presumably reported to command that the operation had gone adequately. The plant that did this to them became known as Jamestown weed. Later, Jimson weed, a slurring of the original name. It grows in the continental United States today. In fields, in gardens, in the gaps between fences where nobody looks twice at a tall weed with white flowers. The plant has never shown any awareness of its history. That is, again, a human habit. The person who decided to put it in a hospital was a German physician named Karl Gauss. Gauss was the kind of doctor who, if you handed him a problem, handed you back a protocol. He kept records the way other men kept grudges, meticulously, personally, and with the quiet conviction that history would eventually prove him right. The problem he was trying to solve was real and old and serious. Childbirth in the early 1900s was terrifying, not metaphorically, literally physically terrifying, for the woman in labour who faced genuine risk of death and who would experience hours of pain with no reliable way to manage it. The maternal mortality rate was high enough that most women entered labour knowing it might kill them. Chloroform existed. Ether existed. But both came with their own serious dangers, and neither was reliably safe for mother or child. Doctors had spent the better part of the previous century arguing about which risks were acceptable. The women bearing those risks were not, for the most part, included in the argument. Gauss had a different idea. Working at the Freiburg Clinic in Germany beginning in 1903, he tried a combination: morphine, at careful doses, for pain; scopolamine, also at careful doses for something more specific. Not sleep, not unconsciousness, memory. The idea was precise and slightly strange. Women would not be unconscious during labour. They would be in a state somewhere between sleep and waking, present in the room, capable of movement, capable of following basic instructions. They would feel the contractions. They would experience the birth. But the scopolamine would ensure they remembered none of it. They would wake up as mothers with no recollection of becoming one. The pain would have happened. The memory would not. He called it Dämmerschlaf, twilight sleep. The name was accurate. It was also, in retrospect, doing some significant marketing work. The technique required, according to Gauss himself, approximately 3 years to master properly. He was not being modest. The Freiburg method involved memory tests every 30 minutes, adjusting the dose of scopolamine based on how well the patient could recall a given object or word. Each woman needed her own custom dosage, calculated over weeks of observation before labour began. Women were required to arrive at the clinic a full month before their due date, so Gauss could get to know them, pharmacologically. Private rooms were essential to minimise sensory stimulation. Women wore dark glasses and earplugs, padded beds to prevent injury during disorientation. One doctor, present and attentive for the full duration of labour, which could mean 16 hours or more. This was not a procedure, it was a production. Gauss used this technique on over 2,000 women. He tracked every outcome. He noted every complication. He presented his findings at a national obstetrics conference in Berlin in 1906 and published them for the medical community to review. The results were good, within his clinic, under his conditions, with his staff, with his 3 years of personal experience managing the drug. He could not have been clearer about what happened when those conditions were removed. Nobody listened to that part. The news reached America in 1914 in McClure's magazine. 2 American journalists, not doctors, not researchers, journalists, had visited the Freiburg Clinic, watched several deliveries, and written an article about what they saw. The article was called Painless Childbirth. It described women going to sleep during labour and waking up, hours later, holding a baby, with no memory of what had happened in between. It described this as a triumph. It was the most widely read piece the magazine had ever published. 2 women with notebooks had visited a German clinic for a week and rewritten how America gave birth. Nobody found this strange at the time. Everybody should have. Women across the country read it. Then they read it again. Then they wrote letters, formed committees, held meetings, and organised. The National Twilight Sleep Association took shape quickly. Its members were suffragists, reformers, women who had experienced childbirth the conventional way and had decided with some feeling that they were not going to do it that way again. They held rallies, they circulated pamphlets, they lobbied hospitals and pressured doctors, and when doctors refused, encouraged their patients to find different doctors. This was not, underneath the surface, a small thing. The movement had genuine moral weight. Women were demanding control over their own bodies, their own pain, their own medical care. At a moment when the suffragette movement was making the same argument in a larger context. The right to vote, the right to choose, the right to not be told by a male physician that a thing you experienced was not as bad as you remembered it. Twilight sleep was, in their framing, a solution to all of that. No pain, no memory of pain, no argument. The demand was real and loud and politically serious. And it was so loud that doctors who refused began to lose patients to doctors who didn't, which concentrates the mind wonderfully. So the doctors complied, many of them, not because they had spent 3 years mastering the Freiburg technique, because their patients wanted it and their waiting rooms needed filling. Some visited Gauss's clinic for a week or 2, observed a handful of deliveries, shook his hand, and boarded a ship home as twilight sleep practitioners. They had watched it. They had not touched it. In medicine, as in most things, these are not the same. Gauss was, by multiple accounts, appalled. He had written clearly that the dosage must be individualized, that fixed doses, giving every labouring woman the same amount regardless of her size, her history, her response, were not just imprecise but actively dangerous. That constant monitoring was not optional, that private rooms, controlled stimulation, and a physician present throughout the entirety of labour were not amenities but necessities. He had recommended 3 years of study before attempting the procedure independently. American hospitals in 1914 were not set up for any of that. They had shared wards, overworked nurses, 12 deliveries in a shift, not one. No capacity to custom calibrate a drug for each patient over weeks of pre-labour observation. What many of them did instead was write twilight sleep in the notes, administer a fixed dose, and hand the patient to a nurse until delivery. Gauss, had he been informed of this, would have had some notes. Nobody asked Gauss. Here is what twilight sleep actually looked like in an American hospital, once the Freiburg precision had been stripped away. The woman was not unconscious. That was the part the campaign's literature had not fully communicated, or had perhaps chosen to underemphasize. She was sedated and confused, but she was also still in labour, still feeling the contractions, still feeling the pain. She just could not interpret what was happening to her. The scopolamine created a dissociated state, present in the room, unable to understand it. Women in twilight sleep thrashed. They called out. They could not be reasoned with, could not be comforted, could not be guided through what was happening to their bodies. The drug did not make them calm. It made them unaware that they were not calm. These are different things. Some hospitals use restraints, knee cuffs, wrist straps, padded mittens to prevent women from scratching their own faces during the disorientation. Nurses documented the sounds from the delivery rooms. So did the neighbours of the buildings that housed them. Some babies were born with difficulty breathing, sedated by the same drugs that had sedated their mothers. Some hospitals quietly discontinued the procedure because of this. They didn't advertise why. And then the woman woke up, feeling fine, feeling often rather refreshed, with no memory of any of it. Her doctor told her the birth had been calm and safe. She believed him because she had no information suggesting otherwise. This was technically true. She had no information suggesting otherwise because the information was gone. The campaign had called this painless. The experience had been pain with the memory removed. These are not the same thing. A woman can scream for 8 hours and wake up believing she slept through it if you give her the right drug. Nobody in an official position was drawing that distinction publicly. The women who knew, the nurses, some of the doctors, were not for the most part the ones writing the pamphlets. In 1915, Frances Carmody died. She had been one of the most visible advocates for twilight sleep in the United States. She had written about it, spoken about it, encouraged other women to demand it. The argument she made, clearly and publicly, was that this was a safe procedure that women deserved access to. She had been a face of the movement. She was in labour with a third child when she died. The delivery was conducted under twilight sleep. Her husband issued a statement saying her death had nothing to do with the procedure. Her doctor agreed. The cause of death was listed as something else. Whether that listing was accurate or convenient or both is not something the historical record makes entirely clear. What is clear is that the National Twilight Sleep Association, which had been building real momentum for the better part of a year, went almost immediately quiet. The rallies stopped. The pamphlets stopped circulating. Individual women continued to request the procedure for years afterward, and individual doctors continued to provide it. But the political campaign, the organised push, the movement, that ended. There was no clean way to keep making the argument. The most prominent advocate for a medical procedure had died during that procedure. Her husband and doctor said it was unrelated. Some women believed them, others drew their own conclusions. Either way, the association had argued that women deserved access. One of its leaders had died from it. The sentence wrote itself, and nobody could unwrite it. The technique faded. The legacy didn't. By the 1920s, something had shifted in American medicine, and the shift was permanent. Childbirth had moved from the home to the hospital. Obstetricians had replaced midwives as the standard attendants. Drug intervention had become the expected approach to labour pain, not an option, but a default. Not something a woman requested, but something the system provided. The Twilight Sleep campaign had wanted this in part. It had wanted women's pain to be taken seriously. It had wanted access to the tools that men's medicine had and women's medicine historically had not. It got those things, in a different form than anyone intended, with different consequences than anyone planned. Well into the 1970s, that's more than 50 years after the Twilight Sleep Association ran its last rally. Most American women were still being heavily sedated during labour. Different drugs by then, milder mostly. But the structure was the same. Woman in a hospital bed, physician in charge, medication as the primary response to pain. The Twilight Sleep era had established that structure, and medicine built on top of it for generations. Natural childbirth advocates in the 1960s and 70s would eventually push back hard against the medicalized model. Second-wave feminists spent the 1960s demanding the right to be conscious during childbirth. First-wave feminists had spent the 1910s demanding the right not to be. Both were right. Neither was talking to the other. But the hospital, the obstetrician, the drug, those stayed. And the plant went on sitting in its garden perfectly still. It had been here before the campaign. It was still here after it. It would be here for whatever came next. It had been doing this, simply existing, doing what plants do, producing its molecules with perfect indifference, for longer than any of these arguments had been going on. Somewhere in Germany, in 1915, it had just helped reshape how an entire nation gave birth. It didn't know that. It was a plant. It had no idea anyone was still looking at it, but someone was. In Texas, a doctor named Robert House was thinking about criminals. He was thinking about lies. And he had just watched a sedated woman do something that he believed, with complete sincerity and no small amount of ambition, nobody under the influence of scopolamine could do. He believed she had told the truth, and he thought he could prove it. Twilight sleep didn't disappear. It just stopped making headlines. What matters is what the drug left behind when it stopped being news. It was still on the shelves, still in use, still producing in sedated patients that same specific state. Compliant, amnesiac, answering questions they had no conscious reason to answer. A drug that erased what had happened was also potentially a drug that could make people say what they knew. All it needed was someone to notice. In a hospital in Texas, someone did. Robert Ernest House was an obstetrician, not a spy, not a criminologist, not a philosopher of truth and deception. An obstetrician, a man whose professional life revolved around birth weights and delivery times and the particular challenges of managing a woman in labour in rural Texas in 1916. He was not famous. He was not especially ambitious as far as the record shows. He had a practice, a specialty, and a working knowledge of the drugs that obstetrics required. He was lean, wire-framed, the kind of man whose opinions arrived before he did. He wrote letters to newspapers. He had views on things. He was, in the polite phrasing of people who knew him, difficult to talk out of a position. He was the kind of doctor who showed up, did the work and went home. Then he had the thought. He was delivering a baby. Routine. The mother was under twilight sleep, the standard protocol by then, even in America, even with Gauss's warning still technically on the books. The morphine and scopolamine were doing their work. The woman was sedated, confused, somewhere between sleep and waking. The room had the particular quality of a delivery room in 1916. Close, warm, the smell of antiseptic and effort. A lamp throwing yellow light across the bed. The husband stood near the door, out of the way husbands stood in delivery rooms then, present but peripheral, uncertain what to do with his hands. He needed the scales, the ones for weighing the newborn. He looked around, couldn't find them, and asked. Not loudly, just asked. To the room in general, to his wife, who was clearly not in a position to answer. The woman answered, clearly, directly, without hesitation. She named the exact location. She was deeply sedated, barely conscious by any measurable standard, and she answered a factual question with perfect accuracy. House stood there. Later he would describe this moment as a revelation. The word is his. He said that watching this woman answer, he suddenly understood something that nobody in medicine had appreciated. The drug had not merely sedated her, it had stripped away something, some layer of conscious control, some capacity for managing what she said and how she said it. What remained, he believed, was only truth. He was wrong, but he would spend 14 years being wrong with extraordinary commitment. The thought was this: she couldn't lie. Not won't, couldn't. House's theory, which he developed, refined and published, with increasing intensity over the next decade, was that scopolamine destroyed the brain's capacity for imagination, and without imagination, he argued, you cannot construct a false statement. You can only report what you know to be true. Lying, in House's framework, was an act of creation. To lie, you had to invent something, an alternative version of events, a cover story, a plausible fiction. And inventing required imagination. Scopolamine, he believed, switched imagination off. What remained was only fact. A patient under scopolamine in House's account could not say anything that wasn't real. Their statements were direct outputs of memory, unfiltered by the deliberate constructive work of deception. It was a neat theory, internally coherent, easy to communicate to a non-scientific audience. It was also not how any of this worked. But House had not studied pharmacology. He had studied obstetrics. He had watched one woman answer one question truthfully. He had extrapolated from that single observation to a complete theory of human deception, consciousness, and the mechanism of lying. He was a Texas obstetrician who had just decided, in his own estimation, that he had solved one of the oldest problems in criminal justice. He was not a modest man about this. The 5 years between the delivery room and his first published article are not well documented. House did not keep a public record of his thinking during this period. What we know is that he kept practicing obstetrics, kept administering scopolamine to labouring women, and kept asking questions. He was testing in the only way available to him, informally, without controls, without a research design, within the normal flow of his clinical work. Each sedated patient was a data point. Each question answered. Each fragment of conversation that emerged from a woman who should have been too far under to speak confirmed what he already believed. This is not how research is supposed to work. The conclusion comes first, and the evidence gets assembled around it. By the time House published his first article in 1921, he had 5 years of observations that he had collected specifically because they supported his theory. The observations that didn't fit, and there must have been some, there always are, do not appear in his papers. He was not lying. He was, in the specific way that true believers are, simply not seeing what he didn't want to see. What he was seeing in those 5 years was this. A woman under twilight sleep, mid-labour, asked what day it was. She answered correctly. A woman asked her husband's name. She said it without hesitation. A woman asked where she kept her mother's letters. She named the room, the drawer, the box inside the drawer. Simple questions, factual questions, questions with clear, verifiable answers, and the answers, more often than not, were right. What House was not recording, or not noticing and setting aside, were the other moments. The woman who said she kept her savings under the floorboards of a house she had sold 3 years ago. The woman who answered a question about her sister, with her sister's name, and then her sister's name again, and then a third name that wasn't anyone's. The woman who gave an address that turned out to be where she had lived as a child, not where she lived now. Memory, under scopolamine, did not produce truth. It produced whatever fragment of memory was closest to the surface, loosened by sedation, offered without the usual editing process. Sometimes that fragment was accurate. Often it was not. The drug did not distinguish. House saw the accurate ones. He filed the rest somewhere he didn't need to look at them. Between 1921 and 1929, he published 11 articles on the subject. 11, in 8 years, on a single drug, about a single claim. With what contemporaries described as increasing polemical zeal. That phrase is not mine. It comes from people reading his work at the time, and it is not a compliment. Each article made essentially the same argument with more force than the last. Each one cited the Dallas experiment. Each one addressed objections by dismissing them. Each one arrived at the same conclusion House had reached on the day a sedated woman told her husband where the scales were. He was, in other words, the kind of man who becomes more certain as the evidence fails to accumulate. He called it the truth serum. Actually, a Dallas newspaper had coined that phrase when reporting on his experiments, and House initially objected. Scopolamine was not a serum. It was a drug. The terminology was imprecise, unscientific, the kind of shorthand that obscured more than it revealed. Then he used the phrase himself, constantly, for the rest of his life. Truth serum was catchier. Truth serum made headlines. House was many things, but he was not oblivious to how language worked. His argument by the mid-1920s had taken on the quality of a mission. He quoted scripture. He quoted the Constitution. He quoted his own earlier articles, which quoted the Dallas experiment, which proved nothing except that 2 innocent men had said they were innocent. He compared truth serum to bloodhounds, a forensic tool, objective, available to the state in service of justice. He was trying very hard to make something respectable that the evidence did not support. And for a while, in certain circles, it worked. Police departments read his articles, prosecutors read them, journalists read them and wrote about them, which caused more police departments and prosecutors to read them. By the mid-1920s, the idea of truth serum had spread well beyond the medical journals where House first published it. It was in newspapers. It was in courtroom arguments. It was in the letters that district attorneys wrote to each other, asking whether anyone had tried this, whether it was admissible, whether it worked. The medical establishment was skeptical. Pharmacologists pointed out politely and then less politely that House's theory about imagination and lying had no basis in any known mechanism of how scopolamine functioned. The drug didn't target imagination specifically. It disrupted acetylcholine signaling broadly, affecting memory, attention, and cognitive function in ways that had nothing to do with the capacity for deception. House responded to these objections the way he responded to all objections. He published another article. The legal establishment was also skeptical, though for different reasons. The courts didn't particularly care how the drug worked at a neurological level. They cared whether it produced reliable evidence, and the evidence, when they examined it, was not reliable. Statements made under scopolamine were inconsistent, frequently incoherent, and produced under conditions that no honest person could call voluntary. But the police were interested in something slightly different from either medicine or law. They were interested in what worked. American policing in the 1920s was genuinely brutal. The third degree extended physical and psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, beatings, was common enough to have a name and a documented history. False confessions were real. Wrongful convictions were real. House's solution was a drug that made people say whatever the person asking the question seemed to want. He had replaced one form of coercion with a quieter one and called it progress. He needed a test case. He found two prisoners at the Dallas County Jail. Both maintained they were innocent of the charges against them. House arranged to administer scopolamine during their questioning. This required some persuasion, some official approval, some degree of institutional cooperation that suggests the idea was not considered entirely outside the bounds of acceptable practice at the time. Both men, under the drug, maintained their innocence. Both were subsequently acquitted at trial. House took this as proof. His theory held. Under scopolamine, men who were innocent said they were innocent. The drug had revealed the truth. What he did not fully account for was the other possibility, that men who were innocent under scopolamine said they were innocent for the same reason they said it when they were sober, because they were innocent. The drug had not revealed anything. It had confirmed what 2 men were already saying. House had given scopolamine to 2 men who were telling the truth, and observed that they continued to tell the truth. He had then concluded that scopolamine made people tell the truth. This is not quite how evidence works. But it was Texas, and it was 1922, and 2 men had been acquitted partly on the strength of a pharmacological experiment, and a Dallas newspaper wrote it up. The phrase truth serum appeared in print for the first time. Robert House was now the father of something. The child was about to cause problems. The story ran in papers across the country, not front page, but picked up, repeated, circulated in the way that ideas with obvious appeal tend to circulate. The concept of a drug that made criminals confess had a very specific resonance with a public that had spent decades watching the justice system fail in visible and sometimes spectacular ways. Wrongful convictions, corrupt police, confessions extracted by violence and then quietly retracted. Truth serum wasn't just a forensic tool, it was a fantasy. The perfect shortcut to certainty in a world that rarely offered any. The phrase caught something in the culture. By the mid-1920s, truth serum had entered popular vocabulary, appearing in novels, in newspaper editorials, in letters to the editor debating its ethics and its promise. People who had never heard of Robert House or the Dallas County Jail were using the phrase. It had detached itself from its origin and was travelling on its own. This is what House had wanted, and it was quietly the beginning of the problem. Because once an idea enters popular culture, once it becomes a phrase people use, a concept people believe in, it becomes very difficult to argue it doesn't work. The courts could reject it, the pharmacologists could question it, but the newspapers kept printing it, the public kept believing it, and somewhere in every police department in America, someone had filed away the thought, if we ever really needed someone to talk, there's a drug for that. House had given that fantasy a name, the newspapers had printed it, and now it was out there, doing what ideas do, spreading without asking permission, landing in minds the originator never anticipated, taking on meanings he hadn't intended and uses he would not have approved. He kept going. Interrogations across the country, more articles, more lectures, more demonstrations. The campaign was evangelical in character. House genuinely believed he had found something important, and he was not the kind of man who sat quietly on important things. He would travel. He would arrive at a police station or a courthouse or a prosecutor's office, carrying his equipment, ready to demonstrate. He would administer the drug to a willing or cooperative subject, sometimes a suspect, sometimes a volunteer, and he would ask questions, and he would record the answers, and he would present the results as evidence of something profound. The results were mixed at best. House did not describe them as mixed. He described them as promising. He framed it as a moral argument. He framed it as a scientific argument. He framed it as a legal argument. The justice system, he said, was riddled with false confessions extracted by violence. Police beat suspects. Police lied. Police manufactured evidence. Scopolamine would eliminate all of that. It was objective. It was modern. It was, in his view, a gift. He was not entirely wrong about the problem. American policing in the 1920s and 30s was genuinely brutal in its interrogation methods. The rubber hose was not a metaphor. The third degree, extended physical and psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, sustained beatings, was common enough to have a name and a documented history. Men confessed to things they hadn't done because the alternative was worse. House's solution to this violence was a drug that made people say whatever the person asking the question seemed to want. He had replaced one form of coercion with a quieter one and called it progress. The courts, when they encountered his work, were not impressed. The defining moment came in 1926. A judge named Robert Walker Franklin was reviewing a case that involved scopolamine-assisted interrogation. The case was a rape case. A man had been accused. House had been brought in to administer the drug and determine whether the accused was telling the truth when he denied the charges. House administered the drug. The man denied the charges. House concluded he was innocent. The case proceeded. The man was convicted anyway. On appeal, Judge Franklin reviewed House's testimony and the scopolamine evidence and wrote an opinion that was not gentle. He called the drug's origins nebulous, He called its effects uncertain. He accused advocates of the technique, and by clear implication House, of inducing credulous people to believe in the magic powers of filters, potions, and cures by faith. Filters, potions, cures by faith. A sitting federal judge had compared truth serum to medieval witchcraft and put it in a legal opinion, on the record, where it would sit forever. House read it. Then he wrote another article. He did not adjust his position. He did not acknowledge the court's reasoning. He cited the Dallas experiment again and moved on. The courts had rejected his evidence. The courts, in his view, were wrong. That was the court's problem. House did not take this well. He kept publishing. He kept lecturing. The court stopped listening. The police had not. The police had found something useful. And it wasn't the drug itself. It was the idea of the drug. A government report from 1931 documented something that would have delighted House and horrified him in equal measure. Police officers, not administering scopolamine, not even possessing it in most cases, were telling resistant suspects that if they didn't cooperate, they would be injected with truth serum, that the drug would extract everything they knew whether they wanted to give it or not, that there was no point in staying silent. The report described the technique with some admiration. An officer would sit across from a suspect. The suspect was not talking. The officer would lean forward and explain calmly that the department had access to a drug, truth serum the newspapers called it, that made it impossible to lie. They could do this the easy way, the officer would say, or they could bring in the needle. Many suspects confessed immediately. Think about what this means. The drug that had failed in every controlled test, that had been rejected by courts as unscientific, that had made OSS interrogations subjects too sick to speak. That drug was in the hands of policemen who never used it, producing confessions at a remarkable rate. The fear of scopolamine extracted more truth than scopolamine ever had. Robert House had spent 14 years trying to prove his drug worked. The police had found a way to use it that didn't require the drug at all. Just the idea, just the threat, just the name on a newspaper page, planted in the mind of a frightened man in a small room, doing its work without a single injection. House died in 1930, the year before that report was published. He died certain that his drug worked, certain that history would vindicate him, certain that the Scales incident in 1916 had been the beginning of something important. He had been fighting for the same idea for 14 years. He had watched courts reject it, watched colleagues ignore it, watched the medical establishment treat his articles with a mixture of polite skepticism and quiet derision. He had responded to all of this by publishing more articles and making stronger arguments and becoming, by the end, a man so identified with a single idea that the two were inseparable. Robert House, truth serum, a Texas obstetrician and his drug. He died still believing. In a way, he was almost right. The drug did change what people said, just not in the direction he imagined. It made them say what other people wanted to hear, under the drug itself, and, as it turned out, under the mere threat of it. His invention had become useful in precisely the way he had argued it shouldn't be, not as a path to truth, but as another tool of coercion, quieter and more deniable than a rubber hose. He had wanted to end false confessions. He had helped create a new mechanism for producing them. His dream didn't die with him. It got dressed in different clothes, classified and handed to people with considerably larger budgets and considerably fewer scruples about how they ran their experiments. The Second World War arrived, as it tends to, and changed everyone's priorities. The United States had a new intelligence organization called the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the forerunner of what would become the CIA. And the OSS had a problem that sounded on paper rather similar to the one Robert House thought he'd solved. They needed people to tell the truth, specifically prisoners of war, enemy agents, people who knew things and did not want to say them, the location of a submarine base, the identity of a double agent, the operational details of a coming offensive, and could not be persuaded through conventional means, and couldn't very well be beaten unconscious in the middle of an officially sanctioned Allied intelligence operation for reasons that were partly ethical and partly practical. A man beaten unconscious tells you nothing. A man who tells you everything might be telling you what you want to hear. The OSS had smart people. They knew the interrogation problem was real. They knew that conventional methods produced unreliable results. They had, in their files, the accumulated history of truth drug research, House's articles, the wartime German experiments with mescaline at Dachau, reports from Allied field operations where chemical interrogation had been attempted with varying and mostly undocumented results. Someone, reading through this material, came across the word scopolamine. Someone else was already experimenting with it. The OSS assembled a research team, scientists, chemists, medical doctors with security clearances, and a mandate to find something that worked. They approached the problem with genuine rigor. They designed tests. They documented protocols. They were, in every formal sense, doing science. They tried scopolamine. They tried mescaline. They tried combinations of drugs. They tried drugs alongside hypnosis. They tried everything the literature suggested and several things it didn't. The German side, meanwhile, was doing the same thing, in Dachau, with subjects who had no say in the matter at all. The same dream, different methods. The moral distance between the two programs was enormous. The scientific results were identical. Both were looking for the same drug. Neither found it. The OSS results were not good. Scopolamine, at the doses required to produce any meaningful effect, made subjects too sick to answer questions coherently. The symptoms were severe. Racing heart, fever, extreme dry mouth, confusion so complete that basic conversation became difficult. Subjects weren't revealing secrets. They were lying down. Mescaline produced something different and equally useless. It made subjects experience things that weren't there, which is not ideal when you're trying to establish facts about the real world. An interrogation subject who is negotiating with the wallpaper about the nature of time is not a productive source of military intelligence. The OSS eventually settled on marijuana, a tasteless, odorless liquid extract they called TD for truth drug, which could be injected into cigarettes and offered to subjects without their knowledge. This required a specific operational process. The cigarettes had to be prepared in advance. The right amount of extract had to be injected into each one, enough to produce a mild loosening effect, not so much that the subject would notice anything unusual. The cigarettes had to look normal. They had to smoke normally. A subject being offered a cigarette in an interrogation setting had to have no reason to suspect it was anything other than a cigarette. Someone, somewhere in the OSS had this job, preparing marijuana cigarettes, injecting them with extract, packaging them, labelling them presumably, filing the paperwork. This person had joined the intelligence services to protect their country during the most consequential conflict in human history, and they were spending their days injecting liquid marijuana into cigarettes. What TD actually produced was, people became somewhat more talkative, somewhat less guarded, somewhat more likely to ramble in ways that could occasionally be useful, not reliably, not consistently, not in ways that produced actionable intelligence at any meaningful scale. The effect was real enough to document, vague enough to be almost useless. This was the best result the most powerful intelligence organization in the world could achieve, a mildly effective cigarette. Robert House had believed he was on the verge of ending wrongful convictions forever. The OSS, building on his work with wartime resources and genuine urgency behind them, had arrived at slightly looser conversation. The gap between the ambition and the result is one of the finer achievements of mid-century institutional science. The war ended. The files were boxed up, classified, and handed to the next organization with an interest in chemical interrogation. The interest absolutely did not end. Here is what nobody in any of these programs had fully understood, and what their collective failure was actually demonstrating. Scopolamine does not make people tell the truth. It makes people highly suggestible. These are not the same thing. They're almost opposite things. A person under scopolamine, asked a question by someone in authority, will try very hard to give that person what they seem to want. If the interrogator believes the subject is guilty and frames questions accordingly, the subject, highly suggestible, unable to resist the pressure of expectation, stripped of the capacity to evaluate and push back, will tend to produce answers that confirm guilt. If the interrogator believes the subject is innocent, the same subject will tend to produce answers that confirm innocence. The drug doesn't unlock what's in a person's head. It hands the interrogator a mirror. Everything they suspected, everything they already believed, comes back to them through a compliant, memory-impaired human being who is doing their best to cooperate. Picture it. An interrogator sits across from a subject. The interrogator believes the subject is guilty. Under normal circumstances, the subject pushes back, denies, deflects, maintains their story. Under scopolamine, the pushback is gone. The subject is helpful, eager to please, highly responsive to the emotional cues in the room. The interrogator frames a question that assumes guilt. The subject reading the room produces an answer that fits the frame. The interrogator writes down, "Confession obtained." This is why House's Dallas prisoners maintained their innocence. Not because scopolamine revealed the truth, because House believed they were innocent. He had arranged to test them specifically because he thought the charges were wrong, and his questions reflected that belief. The drug handed him back what he put in. It is, in this sense, one of the most elegant failures in the history of forensic science. A drug that appeared to confirm whatever the person holding it already thought. Robert House had watched a woman answer a question about scales and concluded that scopolamine made lying impossible. What he had actually watched was a sedated woman answer a simple, factual question. She knew where the scales were. She said where the scales were. The drug had nothing to do with it. But the idea was already loose in the world. And ideas, unlike drugs, do not require a dosage threshold. They just spread. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviet Union was the enemy. There were rumours, taken seriously at the time, later found to be largely unfounded, that Soviet intelligence had developed chemical interrogation techniques that actually worked. Brainwashing, behaviour modification, the perfect truth drug that the West didn't have yet and desperately needed. This fear was not entirely irrational. It had a specific origin. American prisoners of war returning from Korea were saying things that didn't make sense. Some had signed statements confessing to war crimes they hadn't committed. Some were speaking positively about their captors in ways that seemed impossible, given what they had experienced. Some had apparently been persuaded to believe things about their own country that no American soldier should believe. The word brainwashing entered the English language in 1950, coined by a journalist covering the Korean War. It spread quickly because it described something that seemed to be actually happening. The Chinese and Soviets, the fear went, had cracked the code. They had found the technique, chemical, psychological, or some combination, that could reach inside a person's mind and rearrange what was there. The CIA did not want to be behind. They read the OSS files. They read the wartime experiments. They read House's articles, which were publicly available, which anyone could have read, which clearly showed that scopolamine had failed in every controlled test conducted over the previous 3 decades. They looked at all of this evidence and reached the conclusion that large institutions with unlimited budgets and no meaningful oversight tend to reach when confronted with evidence of failure. More experiments were needed. What those experiments would look like, what they would do to the people subjected to them, what they would reveal about the limits of the idea House had launched, is the story of the next decade. A program called MK Ultra was 6 years away. It would have the money House never had, the secrecy the OSS never had, and the complete absence of ethical constraints that the Dallas County Jail had at least nominally maintained. And scopolamine, the drug that had failed in delivery rooms, failed in interrogation cells, failed in wartime intelligence programs, was about to be handed to the most well-funded, least supervised research operation in American history. The plant, somewhere in the Andes, was doing something completely different. It had been doing it quietly, efficiently, and without any government funding since before Robert House was born. Nobody outside of Bogota had noticed yet. MK Ultra launched in 1953, not with a press release, not with a congressional mandate, with a memo classified, signed off by the Director of Central Intelligence, authorizing a program to develop mind control capabilities before the Soviets did. The budget was classified, the methodology was classified, the ethics review was, well, there wasn't one. The man running it was Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was the CIA's chief poisoner, which is a job title that sounds fictional but was completely real, and came with an office and presumably a parking space. He had a PhD in chemistry from Caltech. He had a club foot and a stammer. He kept goats on a farm in rural Virginia. He danced, folk dancing specifically, the kind involving circles and hand-holding and wooden floors. He grew Christmas trees as a hobby. He liked them enough to sell them. On weekends, he was a man who worried about whether his goats were getting enough pasture and whether the Christmas tree saplings were coming in straight. He composted. He probably had opinions about the soil. On weekdays, he ran a covert program to see if human beings could be chemically reprogrammed. In another life, he would have been a pleasant and slightly eccentric organic farmer who made his neighbours uncomfortable at community meetings. In this life, he had an unlimited budget, zero oversight, and a conviction that the human mind was a system that could be hacked. He was also, for what it's worth, technically brilliant. He understood chemistry the way that people who have given their lives to a discipline understand it, from the inside, intuitively, with a fluency that made him dangerous in a very specific way. He could look at a molecule and see its possibilities. He could read a research paper and understand not just what it said, but what it implied. What it implied, in his reading, was that consciousness was breakable. He was about to spend 20 years finding out if he was right. The program's stated goals were ambitious in the way that programs with no accountability tend to be. Develop a truth serum that would make interrogation obsolete, create techniques for memory erasure, find methods to control behavior, to make people act against their will, against their training, against their nature. Identify the pharmacological combination that would turn a human being into something that could be reliably directed from the outside. These goals were written down. They were in the founding memo. They were what the program was for. Gottlieb had House's articles. He had the OSS files. He had reports from every truth drug experiment conducted on both sides of the Second World War. He had, in other words, the complete documented history of human failure in this exact pursuit. He read all of it and concluded, more experiments were needed. The methodology MK Ultra chose was the same one that had consistently failed for the previous 30 years, applied with more money and less restraint. Give people substances without telling them. Observe what happens. This sounds, stated plainly, insane. And it was. But it had a logic that made sense inside the particular paranoia of the early Cold War. if you didn't know what these substances did to unwarned, unprepared people, to people who weren't braced for the experience, who couldn't deploy their defenses because they didn't know there was anything to defend against, then you needed to find out. And you couldn't find out by asking for volunteers, because volunteers would know something was coming. The program needed people who didn't know. The program found them. Scopolamine was on the list. Not at the top, the CIA was casting widely by this point, experimenting with LSD, barbiturates, mescaline, electroshock, hypnosis, and combinations of all of the above. They were not being selective. They were being systematic in the way that people with infinite resources and no consequences tend to be systematic, by trying everything on anyone available and writing down the results. The anyone available was, at various points, CIA employees, army personnel, mental patients, prisoners, sex workers, and members of the public who had no idea any experiment was happening. The consent rate was not 100%. It was not close to 100%. There are documented cases of agents spiking each other's drinks at office parties. There are documented cases of civilians in New York bars receiving scopolamine in their drinks, after which CIA agents watched from behind a two-way mirror and wrote things in notebooks. This particular operation had a name. They called it Midnight Climax. It ran for years in safe houses in New York and San Francisco, funded by the CIA, operated through intermediaries, targeting men who had no idea they were inside a government experiment. The watching was careful. The notes were thorough. The results were, as with everything MKUltra touched, inconclusive. There is a documented case of a man named Frank Olson who was dosed without his knowledge, had a psychological breakdown, and died after falling, or being pushed, from a hotel window. Frank Olson was a CIA biochemist. He was not an enemy. He was not a prisoner or a suspect or anyone the program was designed to be used against. He was a colleague, a scientist who worked for the agency, who was brought to a retreat in Maryland with other CIA personnel, and who, at a dinner on the second evening, had his drink spiked with LSD by Sidney Gottlieb, who thought this was funny or informative or both. What happened afterward was not well documented at the time, because the CIA was not in the habit of documenting things that reflected badly on itself. What is known is that Olson became severely distressed. He had what his family and colleagues described as a breakdown. He was taken to New York to a hotel supposedly to receive psychiatric treatment, and then he went through a window on the 10th floor. The CIA said it was suicide. His family said it wasn't. An investigation decades later found skull fractures inconsistent with a fall. Nobody was charged. Gottlieb retired in 1973 and moved to a commune in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He grew vegetables. He worked with lepers in India. He wrote about inner peace. Before he left, he ordered the MKUltra files destroyed. Most of them were. Thousands of documents shredded or burned, gone before anyone could ask questions. It was, as a records management decision, extremely thorough. In 1977, the Senate held hearings on MKUltra. They had almost nothing to work with. Gottlieb testified. He sat before the committee, this folk dancer, this goat farmer, this man who had spent 2 decades running experiments on people who didn't know they were subjects, and answered questions about a program whose paper trail he had personally eliminated. The senators had to reconstruct what had happened from the documents that survived by accident, misfiled in a building nobody had thought to include in the destruction order. What they found was enough to cause significant public outrage. What they didn't find, what had been successfully burned, nobody could measure. Gottlieb was never charged with anything. He died in 1999, in the house he shared with his wife, still writing about consciousness and meaning and the inner life. None of this was considered, in the operational logic of MKUltra, a problem. It was considered data. Scopolamine, when tested in MKUltra's conditions, produced the same effects it had always produced. The same effects Robert House had observed in a Texas delivery room. The same effects the OSS had documented during the war. High suggestibility, subjects saying what they believed the interrogator wanted to hear, at low doses, dry mouth, blurred vision, mild sedation. Cooperative subjects who answered questions willingly and sometimes inaccurately, at higher doses. Confusion so complete that useful conversation was impossible. Subjects who couldn't maintain a coherent sentence, who lost track of where they were, who sometimes couldn't remember the question before they finished answering it. The program had better equipment than House, better facilities, better funding, better chemists, and it kept arriving at the same place he had. A drug that reflected the interrogator's own assumptions back at them, contaminated with suggestion and fantasy, and the specific desire of a frightened person to give the right answer. Gottlieb, for what it's worth, knew this. He was not a stupid man. He had the data. He could read the results. He kept running experiments anyway, because the program had momentum, and the program had funding, and stopping felt in the Cold War logic of the time like the same thing as losing. The CIA ran MKUltra for 20 years. 20 years. On a program that produced no workable results in the area it was designed to address. The human mind, it turned out, was not a system that could be simply hacked with chemistry. It was too complicated, too variable, too stubbornly individual. What made one person more talkative made another person incoherent. What loosened one person's defences sent another into psychosis. There is no master key, there never was. In 1961, someone in the CIA wrote this down. The report was classified. It stayed classified until 1993, when MKUltra was already becoming a matter of public record through congressional hearings and freedom of information requests, and the slow, embarrassing emergence of documents that the agency had tried very hard to destroy in 1973. Gottlieb had personally ordered the records burned. Most of them were, but not all. Some had been misfiled in a financial records building that wasn't included in the destruction order, and those survived and eventually made their way into the public record, and what they described was not flattering. The 1961 report, the one that had been sitting in a file for 32 years while the CIA continued running programs it had already concluded were useless, contained a sentence that Robert House had never lived to read. The sentence was this: "No such magic brew as the popular notion of truth serum exists." 40 years. 2 world wars worth of intelligence services working independently. Dozens of classified programs. Hundreds of experiments conducted on people who, in many cases, had no idea what was being done to them. And the conclusion, written in careful bureaucratic language and filed away somewhere nobody had to look at it, was, "It doesn't exist. It never existed." The thing everyone had been chasing since a Texas obstetrician watched a sedated woman answer a question about a set of scales. That thing was not real. For the Americans, anyway. Someone else had taken notes. The Czechoslovak State Security Service, the STB, had been watching. Not the American experiments, specifically. They had their own programs, their own files, their own institutional drive toward the same question. But they had also been paying attention to what happened when the drug was actually used, not in controlled research settings, but in real interrogation rooms, on real people, by real agents with real objectives. And what they had noticed was something the Americans kept missing because they were looking for the wrong thing. The Americans wanted truth. They wanted subjects who would reveal accurate information regardless of their wishes. The STB wanted confessions. These are not the same thing. They are, in the specific logic of a security state, almost unrelated. A confession doesn't need to be true. It needs to be usable. It needs to be on record. It needs to say the right things in the right sequence so that the machinery of prosecution can proceed. Whether the person confessing actually did the thing they're confessing to is, legally and politically speaking, beside the point. What matters is that the paperwork exists. Picture the room. A small room. A single overhead light. A table. 2 chairs. An agent on one side. On the other side, a man or a woman who has been arrested for anti-state activities, which in Czechoslovakia in the 1950s and 60s could mean almost anything, and frequently did. Organising, speaking, writing, knowing the wrong people, believing the wrong things. The agent has a syringe. The agent asks the questions. The drug-softened, compliance-maximised subject answers. The answers say what the questions imply they should say. The transcript is produced. The trial proceeds. Scopolamine, it turned out, was excellent at producing confessions. Proven in 2009, when researchers examining STB files confirmed the secret police had used scopolamine in at least 3 documented interrogations of anti-state dissidents. Almost certainly more than 3. 3 are proven, 3 were written down. The files that weren't written down, or weren't preserved, or were destroyed before anyone could examine them, those remain unknown. The drug that couldn't produce truth could produce a confession. Governments have always found that distinction negotiable. While all of this was happening, the CIA programs, the Soviet equivalents, the Cold War chase for pharmacological control, the plant in Colombia was doing something entirely different. It wasn't being studied. It wasn't being classified. It wasn't the subject of any government program or any intelligence file. It was just growing. In gardens, along roadsides, behind houses in Bogotá and Medellín and smaller cities and towns across the Andes. The borrachero tree, the one that makes you drunk, was one of the most common ornamental plants in the country. Angel's trumpet flowers, hanging heavy on their branches, pale and gorgeous and completely unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they contained. It was in parks. It was in the median strips of roads. It grew in the gaps between fences and along the sides of buildings, and in the soil of private gardens tended by people who admired its flowers without knowing what was in them. The question worth asking is why Colombia specifically. The borrachero grows in Venezuela too, in Ecuador, in parts of Brazil. The plant's range is wide. But Colombia became the global epicenter of scopolamine crime in a way that these other countries did not. And the reason isn't the plant. The reason is everything else. Colombia had specific economic conditions that created both the motivation and the infrastructure. Extreme inequality, not unusual in Latin America, but concentrated in ways that made certain districts of Bogotá and Medellín function as hunting grounds, where wealthy foreigners moved through specific neighborhoods, spent money freely, and were far from home with no local support network. They didn't know the city. They couldn't read the social cues. They were, in the particular calculus of predatory crime, easier targets than locals. Colombia also had gang structures that specialized, not in scopolamine specifically, and drug-facilitated robbery as a craft, refined over time, with division of labor and institutional knowledge passed between practitioners the way any specialized trade gets passed on. Some gangs were all women, which gave them access to male targets that male-presenting criminals couldn't reach. Some operated through bars, some through taxis, some eventually through dating apps. The plant was the same plant that grew in Venezuela and Ecuador. The infrastructure was uniquely Colombian, and Colombian criminals had known what it did for a very long time. Criminal use of datura extracts in South America dates to at least the 1950s, possibly earlier, probably much earlier. in a tradition that runs back to the indigenous use of these plants long before anyone was keeping records about criminal pharmacology. The knowledge was local, passed person to person, in the way that practical knowledge gets passed in communities where formal institutions aren't the primary source of information. You knew what the plant did because someone told you. You knew how to use it because someone showed you. The plant was free, the extraction was simple, and the effect, once you understood it, was exactly what a thief needed. The criminal application evolved over decades. Early uses were crude, large doses that produced delirium and unconsciousness, which worked but left evidence, and sometimes caused health complications that ended badly. Refinement happened the way refinement happens in any craft. Through trial and error, through the gradual discovery that less was more, that a smaller dose produced something far more useful than a large one, that a victim who was awake and cooperative was more valuable than a victim who was unconscious and useless. The refinement produced eventually the street criminal's preferred scopolamine experience, a dose precise enough to produce compliance without delirium, enough to remove resistance and memory, not enough to produce the obvious physical symptoms that would attract attention or require emergency services. A victim who could walk, talk, follow instructions and appear, to anyone watching, entirely normal. While the CIA was spending millions of dollars trying to develop a drug that forced people to tell the truth, the criminals in Bogota had already developed something considerably more useful. They just hadn't told anyone. Not the violent, spectacular effects that governments had been chasing. Not delirium, not hallucination, not the incoherent babbling that made interrogation subjects useless. A quiet, cooperative, helpful compliance that left no marks and no memory and no witnesses. Here is what the criminals in Colombia understood that the intelligence agencies never did. You don't need a person to tell you the truth. You need them to cooperate. You need them to get in the car. You need them to walk to the ATM. You need them to punch in their number. You need them to tell you about the second account without you having to ask twice. You need them to pack their valuables into a bag while you hold it open. You need, in the specific operational sense, a person who will do what you say. Scopolamine at street doses, slipped into a drink mixed into food, produced exactly this. Not incoherence, not delirium, not the thrashing, screaming, useless confusion that made MK Ultra's results worthless. A cooperative state, awake, ambulatory, responsive, helpful. The victim walked. The victim talked. The victim answered questions about their bank account with the specific, accurate, usable detail that 3 decades of government research had never managed to extract. Not because the drug made them truthful, because the drug made them compliant, and compliance, it turns out, is far more useful than truth. In the Colombian criminal ecosystem, this procedure had a name: the $1 million ride. A victim, drugged, walked to a cash machine and withdrew the maximum daily limit, then walked to a second machine and did it again, then a third. Sometimes they went home, let the criminals into their apartment, helped them find the safe. Sometimes they handed over their phones, unlocked their laptops, provided passcodes with the helpful specificity of someone giving directions. The criminals usually left the victim somewhere safe, a bench, a park, a cafe entrance. The victims woke up feeling fine. This was the problem. This was the thing that made the crime so efficient and so difficult to prosecute. A victim who woke up feeling fine in a public place, with no physical injuries, no obvious signs of trauma, and no memory of what had happened, was not to themselves, or to anyone around them, obviously a victim at all. And afterward, nothing. No witnesses, no struggle, no evidence that anything unusual had happened. They called it burundanga. They weren't using it in interrogation rooms. They were using it outside ATMS, In New York in the 1970s, someone noticed. The city was a different place then. Rougher, more dangerous. The kind of city where certain kinds of crime were simply part of the landscape. Noted and catalogued and largely unsolved. Times Square was not a tourist attraction. Central Park was not where you went after dark. And within that landscape a specific pattern had emerged among tourists and visiting businessmen that New York toxicologists were struggling to explain. Victims would present at emergency rooms with classic anticholinergic symptoms: rapid heart rate, dilated pupils, extreme dry mouth, confusion, and no memory of the preceding hours, no alcohol in their systems, no conventional drug that explained the presentation. They had been robbed. They knew they had been robbed because the money was gone, and there were sometimes receipts from ATMs they didn't remember visiting. They could not describe what had happened. They could not, in most cases, describe who had been with them. The pattern was specific. The victims were almost always men. They had almost always met a woman or a person presenting as a potential romantic interest. In a bar or hotel lobby, they had accepted a drink. And then some hours later they were here in an emergency room, confused, physically fine, and completely unable to account for the missing time. The toxicologists eventually traced the source: ophthalmologist eye drops. Scopolamine had been in ophthalmology for decades, used to dilate pupils during eye examinations. It came in small bottles. It was legal to purchase, available in any pharmacy with a professional account. And it had been, for a brief and largely unreported period in New York in the 1970s, the drug of choice for a specific kind of robbery so clean and so untraceable that it took considerable detective work even to identify the substance being used. The city health authorities eventually issued a warning. It circulated. It was noted. And then, as these things do, it faded, absorbed into the general noise of a city with more urgent problems, filed under cautionary tales that nobody had the bandwidth to pursue further. Nobody connected it to the CIA files. Nobody connected it to Robert House. Nobody wrote the history that connected a Texas delivery room in 1916 to a New York hotel bar in 1974 to a Bogota street corner in 1985. The crime was old. The attention was new. It was a preview of something much larger. But it would take another 40 years for the world to notice at scale. The year is 2012. A reporter named Ryan Duffy had been sent to Bogota by a media company called Vice to investigate a drug the locals called Devil's Breath. His brief was simple: find it, document it, and try it himself. That was at the time a fairly standard Vice brief. They sent reporters into the world to experience things directly. Duffy had done it before. The plan was solid. His producers flew down ahead of him to set up meetings and do advanced research. Standard procedure. They would establish contacts, arrange interviews, lay the groundwork. By the time Duffy arrived, the plan had changed. He landed in Bogota to find that his producers had spent 3 days hearing accounts that had convinced them, rapidly and firmly, that the plan to sample the drug was not a plan they were going to continue with. They had met dealers who described what it did. They had met victims. They had talked to people who had used it, and people who'd been used by it. And the stories that came back, the specific, detailed, documented stories of what happened when someone put this drug in a drink, were not the kind of stories that made you want to try it. Duffy did not try it. He spent 2 weeks in Bogota instead, interviewing everyone he could find. He talked to a woman who described using it to rob hundreds of men in the city's nightlife districts. He talked to victims who had woken up in different parts of the city with no memory of how they got there. He talked to doctors. He talked to police. He talked to people who had woken up and discovered that they had, under the drug's influence, given away everything they had. Cheerfully, helpfully, with no awareness that anything was wrong. He left as fast as he could. The documentary his team assembled from the footage was called The World's Scariest Drug. It ran in 2012 and was shared by millions of people across the internet, partly because the subject was genuinely disturbing, partly because the title was designed for maximum sharing, and partly because it described something that felt both impossible and completely believable. A drug that removed free will. A drug that turned a person into a cooperative, functional, helpful puppet with no memory afterward. The documentary gave it a name the world would remember: Devil's Breath. And with that name came a story that was partly true, partly exaggerated, and entirely viral. The business cards laced with powder that could drug you on contact, the dust blown in your face on a busy street, the total zombie state, the instant compliance, the complete erasure. Some of this was accurate, some of this was not. The pharmacology experts who commented on the documentary pointed out carefully and then more loudly that several of the more dramatic delivery methods were implausible. Scopolamine absorbed through brief skin contact on a business card. The dose would be far too small. Powder blown in someone's face on a public street producing instant zombie-like effects. Also pharmacologically unlikely. But the documentary had already done its work. The story spread. Not just the accurate parts, the documented robberies, the real victims, the very genuine danger of accepting drinks from strangers in Bogota, but all of it. The business card myth, the face-blowing myth, the instant zombie state. People shared the documentary and added details. People shared the details and added more details. By the time the story had circulated through social media and been picked up by newspapers in 20 countries, scopolamine had become something slightly different from what it actually was. It had become the world's most terrifying drug. The drug with no antidote. The drug you couldn't detect, couldn't resist, couldn't recover from. The drug that could be deployed by a stranger in a crowd and make you its puppet before you took your next step. Some of this was true, some of it was not. None of the nuance survived the journey. Travel advisories appeared. The US State Department issued warnings about Colombia. European governments warned their citizens. The drug had been known in Bogota for decades, had been documented in New York in the 70s, had been the subject of a Wall Street Journal article in 1995, and now, in 2012, it was suddenly a global news story. The world was paying attention now. Whether it was paying attention to the right things was a different question. The crime it had documented was real. The scale it had implied was real. The danger of accepting drinks from strangers in Bogota was real. But the version of the story that went viral, the instantaneous zombie powder, the business card that could rob you on the street, the drug deployed like a weapon in a crowd, that version had taken on a life of its own, separate from the pharmacology, separate from the documented cases, operating on the logic of viral horror rather than the logic of chemistry. And meanwhile, in Colombia, the actual crime continued, not slowing down, not going underground because of the attention, getting more organised, more targeted, more sophisticated. The dating apps that hadn't existed when the documentary was filmed were now the primary recruitment mechanism. The targets were shifting, not just cash, increasingly, but cryptocurrency, hardware wallets, biometric access, things the victims carried in their pockets that were worth more than anything in their bank accounts. The story had been told. The story had spread. The story had made the world afraid of a powder that a stranger might blow in your face. The actual story was still happening in bars and hotel lobbies and on the screens of phones across Bogota. Quieter than the myth, more efficient, and entirely uninterested in whether the documentary had gotten the pharmacology right. He had intended to sample it. By the time he landed, nobody was sampling anything. The documentary made the drug famous for the wrong reasons. That's not a criticism of Ryan Duffy. He went to Bogota, he found a real story, he reported it honestly. The victims he interviewed were real victims. The perpetrators he found were real perpetrators. The drug they described, a substance that removed resistance, erased memory, and left no physical trace, was exactly what scopolamine actually did. What happened afterward was not his fault. What happened was the internet. The internet took the documentary and added layers. The business card story, that someone had pressed a card into a victim's hand on a Buenos Aires street, and the victim had handed over their bank account number before realizing anything was wrong, spread across 12 languages. The face-blowing story that a criminal could blow powder at a stranger in a crowded marketplace and render them compliant within seconds became a warning that circulated in travel forums and expat Facebook groups, and embassy advisories and eventually cable news. Pharmacologists objected, consistently and specifically. Brief skin contact with an object wouldn't deliver a meaningful dose. A puff of powder at someone's face in an open space would disperse before reaching the concentration needed for any significant effect. The documented delivery mechanism, oral administration, in a drink, consumed over minutes, was not glamorous and did not lend itself to dramatic footage. The internet was not interested in the documented delivery mechanism. The myth had a quality the truth lacked, which was that it was frightening in a cinematic way. A stranger pressing a business card into your hand at a busy intersection and walking away, leaving you defenseless with no choice and no recourse. That was a story that spread. The truth, which was that someone had to spend time with you and put something in your drink and wait for it to take effect, was less viral. It required context. It required the acknowledgement that the crime depended on access and opportunity, which meant it could largely be avoided by not accepting drinks from strangers. That was useful information, but it was not a story that made your pulse quicken. The travel warnings that followed the documentary often reproduced the myths alongside the facts. Criminals may blow powder in your face, read advisories from multiple governments. Do not accept business cards from strangers. Real warnings issued by real embassies about a real drug, describing delivery methods that pharmacologists had consistently said were implausible. The pharmacologists were right. The embassies were wrong about the specific mechanism. The embassies were completely right that the drug existed and that people were being seriously harmed by it. Both things were true at once, which is how most public health information tends to work. The myth spread further than the crime, which was in a specific way remarkable, because the crime was already spreading quite well on its own. The Colombian criminal infrastructure around scopolamine was not a collection of desperate individuals improvising alone. It was organized, specialized, efficient in the particular way that any business becomes efficient when it operates in the same market for decades, with very little meaningful interference from authorities. There were gangs, named gangs with known leaders, documented methods, and in several cases enough of an operational history that the police had files on them. Not that the files always helped. Las Despechadas, 9 women. They operated primarily in Bogotá's nightlife districts, Chapinero, Zona T, the bars where foreigners clustered in the evenings. The method was elegant in its simplicity. A woman would approach a man. She would be pleasant, attractive, easy to talk to. She would accept a drink or offer one. At some point in the drink, the drug. Then the $1 million ride. Then the victim left somewhere safe and the woman disappeared back into the city. Over time, their operation grew. They refined it. They coordinated. By the time they were arrested, 9 women had drugged and robbed approximately 2,000 victims. 2,000. Nobody looked twice while they were doing it, because nobody looked drugged. The victims sat at their tables and walked to cash machines and opened their front doors and smiled helpfully at strangers. From the outside, it looked like a perfectly normal evening. From the inside, there was nobody home. Las Despechadas were not the only named gang. There was Los Tomaseros, whose leader operated under the pseudonym Harry Potter. Not a touch of irony intended, just a name that apparently stuck. Los Tomaseros were linked to the drugging and kidnapping of 2 United States Army soldiers who had been drinking in a bar in Bogotá's Zona T. The soldiers were found later, unconscious, in a park. The incident would have been a serious but relatively contained crime story, except that investigators subsequently connected the same gang to the murder of a Colombian female prosecutor, whose body was found in the street some weeks earlier. One gang, multiple incidents, a trail of evidence that the police had been building for months. After the arrests, the full picture emerged. This had not been opportunistic crime. It was organised, methodical, and had been running long enough to accumulate a significant number of victims before anyone was charged with anything. La Reina de la Scopolamina, the Queen of Scopolamine. She earned the title the way most titles are earned, through volume, through consistency, through a level of operational focus that her colleagues found either admirable or alarming depending on their perspective. She operated through dating apps. This was the evolution. The bars were still there, the nightclubs were still there, but the dating app was cleaner, more targeted, less dependent on chance. You could select your victim before you were ever in the same room. You could profile them. Men travelling alone. Men who had listed themselves as visiting the city. Men whose profiles suggested they had money and no local knowledge, and no one nearby who would notice if they didn't come home on time. The apps also offered something bars didn't. A record. A conversation history. A set of messages that could, if needed, establish a plausible narrative about a consensual encounter that simply went wrong somehow, through no one's fault, circumstances unclear. A victim who'd been chatting enthusiastically with someone for 2 days before agreeing to meet them had a harder time explaining to himself, let alone to police, exactly how this constituted a crime. She would match with them, she would message, she would suggest a drink, a restaurant somewhere public and respectable. She would arrive, she would be charming, and then at some point in the evening, the drink. The next morning, or however many hours later, the man would wake up in a hotel room or on a street or in a taxi he couldn't remember taking, and he would try to piece together what had happened from a phone full of evidence and a memory full of nothing. She was linked to at least 8 documented cases involving foreign men, all following the same pattern. She was arrested in Itagüí. Her name was not publicly released. The dating apps were not her invention. By the time she was using them, they were the standard. The methods had diversified over the years in ways that reflected both criminal ingenuity and the specific vulnerabilities of different victim populations. Bars and nightclubs remained the most common setting. A drink, a conversation, a moment when the glass was unattended or the attention was elsewhere. The drug dissolved invisibly. It had no taste, no colour, no smell to notice. Taxis were the second most common. Not the official taxis. Those had some accountability, some paper trail, some record that could be traced. The unofficial ones. The driver who pulled up outside the airport arrivals hall before the passenger had phone service or local orientation, who knew exactly how to identify a foreign visitor carrying luggage and pulling out a phone to find a legitimate ride. The ride might last 20 minutes. The drug, in an offered water or a piece of offered gum or applied through some other method in the confined space of the car, would begin to take effect before the journey ended. By the time the passenger arrived at their destination, the driver had a compliant, cooperative, unhelpful witness to whatever was about to happen next. Some cases involved the drug being added to cocaine or marijuana sold to foreign visitors. visitors who thought they were buying a recreational drug and received a different one instead, or alongside it. The scopolamine made them compliant. The criminals who had sold it to them then robbed them. This particular method had a specific efficiency. The victim had already demonstrated their willingness to engage in a transaction outside normal channels. They were unlikely to go to the police. Some cases involved creams, moisturizing creams, hand creams, applied by the victim to themselves after the criminal had somehow made contact. The transdermal absorption was slower than oral ingestion but could still produce effects. At least one documented case involved exactly this delivery method. And then there were the apartments. Some victims didn't remember leaving the bar. They would wake up in their own home or their own hotel room to find the safe open, the valuables gone, the electronics missing. Under the drug, they had apparently led their attackers back, opened their own front door, provided the combination, and then at some point the attackers had left and the victim had fallen asleep in the wreckage of their own evening without understanding any of it. What made the apartment cases particularly difficult to document was that they produced no witnesses at all. There was no CCTV of a struggle, no bartender who had noticed anything unusual, no taxi driver, nothing. Just an apartment with a safe open and a person who had woken up inside it and couldn't account for the previous 6 hours. The drug didn't need to do anything dramatic. It just needed the victim to cooperate for long enough. There is a dimension of this story that doesn't get told often, and it needs to be said plainly. Scopolamine was not only used for robbery. In a number of documented cases, the drug was used to facilitate sexual assault. The victim was compliant, conscious, cooperative. The victim remembered nothing. The victim afterward sometimes couldn't be certain anything had happened at all, which was, in the specific logic of someone who had done this deliberately, the point. The numbers are difficult to establish. A researcher writing for Wired reported that approximately 70% of Bogotá's documented scopolamine victims had been robbed and about 3% had been sexually assaulted. But these are the documented cases, the ones where a victim went to a hospital, where a toxicology screen was run, where a report was filed. For sexual assault specifically, the barriers to reporting are significant under any circumstances. When the victim has no memory of the assault and the drug has already left their system by the time they seek help, those barriers are close to insurmountable. The drug clears the body quickly. Scopolamine's half-life is short enough that by the time a victim wakes up confused on a park bench, pieces together that something has happened, makes their way to a hospital or a police station, and this process alone can take hours, sometimes a day or more, particularly when the victim is a foreigner in a city they don't know, without local language, without local contacts. By the time all of that has happened, the toxicology screen comes back clean. No drug detected, which means no evidence of what was administered, which means the victim's account of what happened, already fragmented and uncertain, is the only record that exists. And a victim who cannot clearly describe their attacker, cannot account for several hours of their own movements, and whose tox screen shows nothing. That victim is not a straightforward case to prosecute. This is not a coincidence. The properties that make scopolamine useful as a criminal tool, rapid, onset, high compliance, amnesia, fast clearance, are also the properties that make it nearly impossible to prosecute after the fact. The drug was not designed to be untraceable. It just is. The man who called himself a shaman was one of the worst cases to reach public documentation. He was not a healer. He was a man who had identified a specific vulnerability. People who came to Colombia seeking spiritual experience, ayahuasca ceremonies, plant medicine retreats, the particular kind of tourist who arrived not looking for nightclubs, but for something they called transformation or healing or connection to something larger. These tourists were, in a specific way, more vulnerable than others. They had come specifically to ingest substances in the company of a stranger. They expected altered states. They expected to surrender control to a guide. They had in some cases told no one exactly where they were going or with whom. He advertised spiritual services. Women came to his home, expecting a ceremony. He drugged them with scopolamine and assaulted them. He was arrested after the first woman came forward. After his arrest, dozens more women came forward. Think about what that number means. 38 women who had each gone through the same experience, who had each spent some period of time not knowing exactly what had happened to them, who had each made the calculation that victims of this kind of crime make silently and alone about whether to say anything. 38 of them, after his arrest, decided to. The ones who didn't are not counted. The number itself contains a story about what happens to the cases that don't result in arrest, about the women who didn't know what had been done to them, about the ones who knew something had happened but couldn't prove it, about the ones who never told anyone. The numbers undercount, almost by definition. You can't report what you don't remember. The crime, in various forms, was meanwhile leaving Colombia. It had been in New York in the 1970s. It had been documented in Venezuela and Thailand and other places where Colombian criminal networks or their knowledge travelled. But before the post-documentary spread, there was a moment when the Western world got its first real look at what was happening in Bogotá and largely looked away. In 1995, the Wall Street Journal published a piece on Burundanga. Not a brief mention. A full article reporting that the drug was responsible for approximately half of all poisoning admissions at Bogotá's emergency rooms. A figure that was later disputed, but that indicated the scale of what was happening. The figure came from hospital records. The reporters had spoken to doctors, to victims, to police. The picture that emerged was of a crime that had been running at scale for years, that was well known within Colombia, and that the rest of the world had simply not been paying attention to. The article ran. It was read. It was noted in the kind of circles that note these things. Security consultants, State Department analysts, the specific type of traveller who reads the Wall Street Journal and files information away. And then, largely, it was absorbed into the background noise of foreign crime statistics that don't quite reach the threshold of sustained Western attention. Colombia in 1995 had many problems that were competing for the same column inches. The drug that made you compliant was not, in that context, the most alarming story on offer. It would take 17 more years and a viral documentary to change that. The post-documentary period saw something different. A spread that followed the attention rather than just the networks. Paris, 2015. 3 members of an international criminal organisation, triad-linked by police accounts, were arrested for a series of robberies targeting elderly people. The method was the same scopolamine in a drink approach that had been running in Bogotá for decades, transplanted to Paris, adapted slightly for a different victim population. The elderly targets were approached in the street, often near their homes or in their neighbourhoods. Someone would stop them with a question, or point out a stain on their coat, or ask for help with something that required close physical proximity. During the interaction, scopolamine was administered, in some cases apparently through a handshake, though pharmacologists remained sceptical of the efficiency of transdermal absorption in such brief contact. In other cases, likely through a drink or food offered and accepted. Whatever the precise mechanism, the result was consistent. The victim became cooperative. They went home, or to their bank, or led the criminals to where their valuables were kept. The amounts stolen were significant, in aggregate millions of euros across dozens of victims before the network was disrupted. 3 arrests, a network of unknown size, cases that had almost certainly occurred and gone unreported across multiple countries. London, 2019. An Irish dancer named Adrian Murphy was killed. He'd been targeted by thieves who used scopolamine to facilitate the robbery. What should have been a robbery became a murder through a combination of dosing and violence that the investigation never fully untangled. The drug that had been dismissed as a South American problem, a Colombian problem, a problem for tourists who made poor decisions in nightclubs. That drug had now contributed to a murder in Western Europe. There were ongoing cases in the United Kingdom. A woman reported symptoms consistent with scopolamine exposure after being approached on public transport. Reports from Germany, reports from the Netherlands, each one individually explainable, collectively indicating a method that had travelled far from where it began. The borrachero tree doesn't grow in Paris. Someone had made the trip, and then 2023 arrived and the numbers became impossible to ignore. In the last 3 months of that year, the number of robberies targeting foreign visitors in Colombia increased by 200%. Deaths of foreign visitors were up 29% over the same period the previous year. Within 2 months, 8 American citizens died in suspicious circumstances in Medellin. The US Embassy in Bogotá was receiving reports daily. The deaths were not all connected. They didn't share a perpetrator or a location or a specific sequence of events. What they shared was a pattern: foreigners, dating app contacts, drugging. In several cases, a body found somewhere that made no sense given where the person had last been seen. The typical sequence, reconstructed from the cases that were documented in detail, went something like this. A man, usually travelling alone, matched with someone on a dating app. The profile was attractive, the conversation was easy, the suggestion to meet was natural. They met somewhere public, a bar, a restaurant in El Poblado, one of the districts foreigners favoured. The evening went well. A drink was accepted. At some point in the next hour, the drug took hold. The man's phone continued to exist, pinging cell towers, until it went dark. His bank account showed withdrawals from ATMs in different parts of the city. His hotel key was used after midnight. In the morning he was found, or wasn't found for several days, at which point the circumstances were difficult to reconstruct. The embassy warning that followed was specific in a way that embassy warnings rarely are. It named the method. It named the apps. It told citizens to meet in hotel lobbies rather than bars, to not leave their drinks unattended, to tell someone where they were going and to check in. The drugs were not always scopolamine specifically. Benzodiazepines were also being used, and the combination of scopolamine with a sedative was common enough that toxicology reports couldn't always determine which had been the primary agent. The point was the method, the compliance, the robbery, the disposal. In Bogotá alone, the Metropolitan Police recorded 1,409 cases of scopolamine poisoning in 2023, a 16% increase over 2022, which had itself been an increase over the year before. The cryptocurrency dimension was new, not new as a concept. Scopolamine had always been used to get victims to unlock things, provide combinations, hand over access. But the specific target had shifted. A hardware wallet containing Bitcoin or Ethereum could hold hundreds of thousands of dollars in an object the size of a USB drive. A victim who could be walked through the unlock sequence, who could be prompted to press their thumb to a sensor, or hold their face to a camera, or enter a 24-word seed phrase they had memorized, was worth considerably more than a victim who could be walked to an ATM. The compliance requirement was actually lower than for conventional robbery. The victim didn't need to remember anything. They didn't need to understand what was happening. They just needed to perform the physical actions, the fingerprint, the face, the code, while the criminals guided them through the steps. The entire process could take 10 minutes. The amount transferred could be the equivalent of a decade's conventional robbery. Cases were being reported of victims who had woken up to find not their cash gone. They had relatively little cash. but their entire digital financial life emptied. Amounts that dwarfed any conventional robbery. And unlike cash, cryptocurrency transactions were in some cases traceable after the fact, but by then the funds had already moved through several wallets, and the chain of custody was impossible to establish in a way that led back to a prosecution. The US Embassy issued a formal advisory. The Colombian government issued statements. Several European governments updated their travel warnings. The borrachero tree still growing in the gardens of Bogotá issued nothing. It was still just a tree. There is one more thing to say about scopolamine before we leave Colombia. The drug that had become the world's most famous criminal tool. The drug that had been documented in a viral video and given a terrifying name and made the subject of international travel advisories. That drug was simultaneously available, legally, over the counter, in every pharmacy in the Western world. Behind the pharmacist's counter, sometimes just on a shelf, a small circular patch, about 2.5 centimeters across, beige-coloured, packaged in a sealed foil wrapper with instructions printed on the back. Transderm Scop brand name. Scopolamine, 1.5 milligrams, delivered slowly through the skin over 72 hours. Approved by the FDA. Recommended for motion sickness, post-operative nausea, seasickness. Used by cruise ship passengers, by people who get seasick, by patients recovering from surgery, not a controlled substance in the United States. No prescription required in most countries. You wore it behind your ear. You applied it the night before your voyage, following the instructions, then after 3 days you peeled it off and put on a fresh one if needed. Many people did this without incident. Many people still do. The same molecule. A fraction of the dose, delivered slowly, carefully, with the full knowledge and consent of the person wearing it. The world's scariest drug is also what your grandmother wears on cruises. Picture the cruise ship, the deck, the railing, a woman in a sun hat watching the coastline of somewhere warm go by. Behind her right ear, a small beige patch, barely visible, doing its quiet work. She applied it last night, following the instructions on the packet. She'll feel fine for the duration of the voyage. She will have no memory problems, no compliance issues, no episodes of involuntary cooperation with strangers. At ATMs, she will simply not be seasick. Picture Bogotá simultaneously, a few thousand miles to the south. A bar in Chapinero. A foreign man accepting a drink from someone he met 20 minutes ago. The same molecule at a different dose delivered differently, serving a completely different purpose. The molecule doesn't have a personality. We gave it several. While all of this was happening, the gangs, the dating apps, the deaths in Medellin, the travel advisories, the mythology spreading across the internet faster than the pharmacology could catch up with it. A group of researchers at a government institute in Maryland was looking at a completely different problem. They were not studying scopolamine. They were not studying crime. They were not studying Colombia or truth serums or any of the things we have been following for 4 blocks now. They were studying depression. Specifically, they were studying a particular kind of depression, the kind that doesn't respond to anything. The patients who had tried every antidepressant available and felt nothing, or felt worse, or felt briefly better, and then fell back. The treatment-resistant cases, the people for whom the existing pharmacological toolkit had been exhausted without result. These researchers were trying to find something new, and they kept noticing something strange. Patients who were receiving scopolamine as part of unrelated studies, for its anticholinergic properties, for its effects on memory, as a research tool for studying cognition, were coming back to check-in appointments different from how they had left. Not just less nauseous, not just slightly more comfortable, different in a way that showed up clearly in their assessment scores and in what they said when asked how they were feeling. Better. Not all of them. Not consistently. But enough of them and in a way reproducible enough that the researchers stopped what they were doing and ran the study again. The results held. They ran it again, more formally, with proper controls. Depression symptom scores dropped significantly in patients receiving scopolamine, not gradually the way antidepressants typically worked, requiring weeks of daily dosing before anything shifted. Quickly, within days, in some patients within a day. The effect was faster than anything the team had seen from any conventional antidepressant in any of their previous studies. The patients they were treating were not mild cases. These were the ones who had already tried everything, the ones who'd been on every SSRI available without relief, the treatment-resistant cases, the ones whose doctors had run out of options. Those were the patients in whom scopolamine was producing the fastest, clearest antidepressant response anyone at the Institute could remember documenting. The researchers looked at their data. They looked at each other. They were not looking for truth. They were not looking for compliance. They were not looking for any of the things that had made this molecule famous. They were looking for something harder to find, a reason to get out of bed. The NIMH researchers hadn't set out to discover an antidepressant. They had been using scopolamine as a research tool, the kind of drug you administer to study something else, a controlled variable, a means to an end. The end was cognition research, memory research, the kind of work that fills academic journals with findings most people will never read. Specifically, they were using scopolamine to model memory impairment. The drug's well-documented effect on memory formation made it useful for creating a controlled, temporary, reversible cognitive deficit in healthy subjects, a way to study what memory impairment looked like and how it could be measured without waiting for patients who had it naturally. You gave a healthy person scopolamine. You observed the memory problems it produced. You measured them carefully. You waited for the drug to clear, and you had data. This was, in other words, a program designed to study the drug making people worse. The patients who came back to their follow-up appointments feeling unexpectedly better were not supposed to feel unexpectedly better. They were supposed to have been temporarily cognitively impaired, noted, and returned to baseline. The improvement was noise, an anomaly, something to set aside and continue with the actual research, except it kept happening. And then the patients kept coming back different. Not all of them, not every time, but reproducibly, measurably, in a way that showed up clearly in their depression rating scores, the MADRS, the standard clinical yardstick for how bad things actually are, in their own self-reports, in the specific way they walked into a follow-up appointment versus how they had walked out of the last one. The team ran a formal clinical trial. They gave IV scopolamine to patients with major depressive disorder, many of whom had already moved through SSRI after SSRI without relief, fluoxetine, sertraline, venlafaxine, the full alphabet of modern antidepressants exhausted without result. Against these patients, scopolamine produced a 53% reduction in depression scores. The placebo produced 6.5%. The effect began within days, in some patients within a day. SSRIs, under the best circumstances, require 3 to 4 weeks of daily dosing before anything shifts. Scopolamine was producing results in the patients who hadn't responded to anything faster than anything the field had seen. The motion sickness drug was outperforming Prozac. In the patients, Prozac couldn't help. The pharmacologist needed to understand why. The obvious answer was the wrong mechanism. SSRIs work on serotonin. Scopolamine doesn't touch serotonin. It works on something called muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, a completely different system in a completely different part of the neurotransmitter landscape. The two drugs don't share a pathway. They're not cousins. They're not even in the same family, which meant that scopolamine's antidepressant effect had nothing to do with the system. that the entire field of antidepressant pharmacology had spent 50 years optimizing. The cholinergic system, the one scopolamine acted on, had been suspected to play a role in depression for decades. There was a hypothesis, there were papers, there was a small and underfunded research tradition that had pointed at this system and said, "We think this matters." The hypothesis had a specific origin. In the 1960s and 70s, researchers noticed that drugs which enhanced cholinergic activity tended to worsen depressive symptoms, while drugs that blocked it, like scopolamine, tended to improve them. The pattern was consistent enough to generate a theory that the balance between cholinergic and monoaminergic activity in the brain was involved in mood regulation, and that depression involved cholinergic overdrive. The theory was published, it was discussed, it was cited in a small number of subsequent papers, and then, largely, it was left there. The field moved towards serotonin. The discovery of fluoxetine, Prozac, in the 1980s provided a clean, patentable, commercially viable mechanism that worked for a substantial proportion of patients. The pharmaceutical investment followed the commercial logic. SSRIs became the dominant model. The funding went there, the researchers went there, and the cholinergic hypothesis sat in the literature like a door that nobody had time to open. The larger field had largely looked elsewhere. It had looked elsewhere, spent 50 years and enormous resources developing drugs that targeted serotonin and norepinephrine, and produced medications that worked for many people and failed for many others. Specifically the most severe cases, the treatment-resistant ones, the people for whom the conventional toolkit was insufficient. And then, by accident, a research team using scopolamine for a completely different purpose stumbled into the mechanism that those underfunded papers had been pointing at for decades. The mechanism nobody was looking at turned out to be the one that worked fastest. There is an irony in this that takes a moment to appreciate fully. Scopolamine's criminal power rests on a specific property. It blocks the formation of new memories. The victim's experience simply doesn't get recorded. What happened in that bar, in that taxi, on that evening? It's not hidden somewhere inaccessible. It was never written down. The drug doesn't erase. It prevents the writing. That same property may be part of why it works as an antidepressant. Depression is, among other things, a disease of weighted memory. The brain under severe depression doesn't process all experiences equally. It preferentially encodes and retrieves the painful ones. The neutral moments slip away. The dark ones stay and accumulate. The result, over time, is a mind that has built a case against itself from its own archive. Every failure remembered clearly, every small good thing filed without weight. The cholinergic system plays a role in this process, in the consolidation of memories, in the weighting of emotional content, in what gets preserved and how heavily it gets marked. When scopolamine blocks muscarinic receptors, it disrupts this process, and in disrupting it, in temporarily interfering with the machinery that keeps building the case, it may allow the system to reset. The drug that took things away from victims may work by taking away, from patients, the accumulated weight of things they cannot stop carrying. The drug that took things away was being used to give something back. This discovery, clean as it was, did not immediately transform into available treatment. Medicine rarely works that way. The practical challenges were real. Scopolamine's antidepressant effect in the trials required intravenous administration as an IV drip in a clinical setting under supervision. You couldn't take it as a pill from a pharmacy. You couldn't do it at home. You needed a doctor, a needle, a room. For a drug that costs almost nothing to produce, this is a significant logistical barrier, and the logistical barrier sat on top of a reputational one. The drug's name in the popular imagination was Devil's Breath. The documentary had been seen by tens of millions of people. The headlines about Colombian gangs, dating apps, and 8 Americans dead in Medellin had run in every major newspaper in the Western world. Hospital ethics boards, when presented with a proposal involving scopolamine, had to be walked through a conversation that no ethics board should technically need to have, which was, yes, this is the same molecule, and no, we are not proposing to drug patients without their knowledge and walk them to ATMS. The research pipeline also runs into the specific problem of novelty. Scopolamine is not patentable. It's a natural compound. It's been known for over a century, and any pharmaceutical company that developed an IV scopolamine protocol for depression would be developing something competitors could immediately copy. The financial incentive to fund the research is smaller than it would be for a novel synthetic compound, so the research proceeds more slowly than the results might seem to warrant. There is a precedent for this obstacle being overcome: ketamine, another drug with a complicated reputation, another drug that required IV administration, another fast-acting antidepressant that worked through a different mechanism than SSRIs and produced rapid results in treatment-resistant patients, faced exactly the same barriers. The same ethics board conversations, the same insurance resistance, the same stigma problem given ketamine's history as a recreational drug. It took decades of research and advocacy before an esketamine nasal spray was approved by the FDA for treatment-resistant depression in 2019. Scopolamine is roughly where ketamine was 30 years ago. The results are clear. The mechanism is being understood. The barriers are institutional, financial, and reputational rather than scientific. The molecule that government spent decades trying to weaponize is now being held back from patients, partly because government spent decades trying to weaponize it. This is not, in the history of pharmacology, the most surprising outcome, but it is among the more ironic ones. While the clinical trials were inching forward, the molecule was somewhere else entirely. It was in orbit. NASA had been dealing with space motion sickness since the beginning of human spaceflight. It turned out that removing gravity did interesting and consistently unpleasant things to the human vestibular system, and a significant proportion of astronauts spent their first days in space incapacitated by nausea in a confined metal tube very far from any medical facility. Various drugs had been tried. The one that worked best, reliably and consistently, was scopolamine, often in combination with dextroamphetamine, to counteract the sedating effect. The Skylab missions in the 1970s used this combination. Later missions refined it. NASA researchers in more recent years investigated intranasal delivery specifically, looking for a formulation that would work without an injection and without the side effects that made oral administration difficult in a weightless environment. The borrachero tree grows in the Andes. It has been growing there, producing its molecules for longer than any human institution has existed. Something it makes has been in orbit. There's no particular lesson in that. It's just the plant doing what the plant does, indifferently productive, unaware that its chemistry has travelled beyond the atmosphere, been tested by astronauts, studied by researchers, used by criminals, worshipped by healers, feared by governments, and worn behind the ears of people on cruise ships watching warm coastlines go by. The borrachero tree doesn't grow in space, but something it makes has been there. It is worth, at this point in the story, looking at the ledger, not as a judgment, just as an accounting. Scopolamine has been used across its documented history for the following purposes: to sedate labouring women and erase their memory of birth, administered with restraints in some cases, because the sedation produced confusion rather than calm, and the women needed to be prevented from injuring themselves during a procedure that was supposed to help them, to convince a Texas obstetrician that human beings cannot lie, which turned out to be wrong, to assist the interrogation of criminal suspects on the theory that it produced truth, which it did not. to assist Allied intelligence operations during World War in experiments that determined it made subjects too sick to be useful, and in a marijuana cigarette program that produced slightly looser conversation, to control the minds of unwitting civilians dosed in safe houses in New York and San Francisco, in a program that ran for years, destroyed lives, and concluded that no magic brew exists. To extract confessions from dissidents in Czechoslovakia who may or may not have done what the confessions described. To facilitate the robbery of approximately 2,000 women by 9 women in Bogotá's nightclubs. To facilitate the robbery and sexual assault of victims by a man who called himself a healer. To facilitate the robbery of elderly people in Paris and the murder of a dancer in London. To treat nausea on cruise ships, on Skylab, in post-surgical recovery rooms. To lift the mood of depressed patients faster than any drug in the modern pharmacological toolkit. The molecule in every one of these cases is the same. The molecule did not change. We kept finding new things to want from it. The plant itself, the borrachero, this one that makes you drunk, is still there. In the gardens of Bogotá and Medellin, in the hedgerows of Colombia, in the median strips of roads and the soil between fences, growing with the particular indifference of things that existed long before anyone was watching them, and will continue existing long after the watchers have moved on. Datura, its cousin, the Jimson weed, grows across the continental United States, in fields, in vacant lots, along roadsides in Texas and California and the American Southwest. Pretty flowers, trumpet-shaped, white or pale purple, toxic. The plant that sent British soldiers in Jamestown wandering for 11 days with no memory of any of it. Still there. Henbane grows across Europe and Asia, the plant of medieval witches and Roman poisoners, the one that dreamers cultivated in monastery gardens and that apothecaries sold for 3,000 years before anyone understood what was in it. Still there. These plants have been causing problems and solving problems, generating history and generating molecules, for as long as humans have been around to notice them. They were here before the CIA. They were here before Robert House. They were here before Gauss's delivery rooms and the National Twilight Sleep Association and the Czechoslovak secret police and the Vice documentary and the dating apps of Medellin. They will be here after. The plant is still there. In gardens, in hedgerows, in the gaps between fences. It's been there the whole time. Every person in this story wanted something. Gauss wanted to solve pain. The women who campaigned for twilight sleep wanted control over their own bodies. Robert Howes wanted justice and certainty, and a world where the guilty couldn't hide behind words. The OSS wanted to win a war. Sidney Gottlieb wanted to understand consciousness well enough to break it. The Czechoslovak secret police wanted confessions. The criminals in Bogotá wanted money. The researchers at the NIMH wanted to help people who could not be helped. Every single one of them turned to the same molecule, and the molecule cooperated in its quiet way with all of them. Not because it understood what they wanted, not because it had preferences or loyalties or any opinion on the matter, because that is what molecules do. They fit into receptors. They block pathways. They change what happens next in a chain of chemistry that runs through every thought and memory and feeling a human being has ever had. The molecule blocked an acetylcholine receptor. That's the whole of what it did. We did everything else. The doctors who administered it, the spies who tested it, the criminals who refined it, the researchers who accidentally discovered something useful, all of them convinced that they had found a tool for control. Control of pain, control of truth, control of other people, control of the darkness in someone's own mind. The molecule offered no opinion on any of this. It still doesn't. The borrachero tree is flowering again. The flowers hang heavy on their branches, pale in the morning light, indifferent to the season and to the story and to the entire accumulated history of what humans have made of what they contain. It produced its molecules today. It produced them yesterday. It will produce them tomorrow. It has no idea that a government agency once classified what it makes as a potential weapon. It has no idea that a man in Texas spent 14 years arguing about it in medical journals. It has no idea that its chemistry has been in orbit, been in the bloodstream of women who wanted a painless birth, been in the drinks of people who never knew anything was wrong. It is a plant. It has no opinion about any of this.